Namaste. So, as part of writings of Aurobindo, today we take up collected works of Aurobindo, volume 27. Letters on Poetry and Art. Now, this volume, it's amazing because very often it's part of the series on letters on yoga. And earlier in SABCL, it was not separated. There was one there were 3 volumes of letters on yoga, and of course there were certain letters on himself, etc. But now they have discovered a lot of letters, and it's very nice that the present editors have segregated this volume separately. The beauty of this volume is that very often people may think it's only about those interested in poetry, art, music. But actually, there is so much profound truths about yoga, about life in general. And of course, one wants to understand all about poetry because Aurobindo identified himself mainly as a poet. I mean, apart from the yogi and Yogeshwar rather, and the avatar bearing the burden. But in terms of his expression, I mean, if I may use the language of the Gita, just as Sri Krishna calls himself also Vibhuti, that among the Vrishnis he is Vasudev Krishna. So I would say if Sri Aurobindo was to use a similar terminology in that state of consciousness, that among the poets, though I know he is a perfect gentleman full of humility, he would not say so, but one may well so that among the poets he is Sri Aurobindo. Because not only has he written poetry which is of the beyond the highest class, if I may say so, but he has revealed such profound truths about the poetry. Like last time we read about the mantra, about the future poetry. So such profound truths he has revealed about poetry that I think even modern poets, many of them find difficult to really grasp, because unlike this idea that art for art's sake and poetry for the sake of poetry, he brings out poetry also as a medium of expression and manifestation of the divine. And why not? Because if we really look at especially the yogis and mystics, we see that they have used poetry as a means of expression. So this volume is primarily a collection of letters, so it's very easy to read. You to just go on reading the letters. They are very well titled, subtitled. You can pick and choose whatever we want to read. And they're very interesting asides. For example, there is a whole section on the world's greatest poets. So they are very interesting. The disciple has asked him about to rank the world's greatest poets among Valmiki, Kalidas, Homer, etc., etc. And Sri Aurobindo ranks them. And the disciple asks, what about Vyas? Is the omission deliberate? He says, no, you didn't ask me. You didn't include Vyas, so I have not mentioned. But otherwise, if I have to rank, then Vyas would rank among the greatest of all poets. So Vyas and Homer, but he ranks Vyas even greater. So there are very interesting things about, of course, Indian literature and world literature. So it's something amazing. I mean, just to take some of the chapters before we read, I just want to read some of these letters so that we can enjoy it. So there are 3 main parts. One is poetry and its creation. So it's all about the technique of poetry and how poetry comes, from what source, and what really is the poetry that emerges from the spirit. There is a very interesting, there are interesting subsections. For instance, he speaks about overhead poetry, which is one of the terms that Sri Aurobindo has used, that poetry to be truly regarded as of a deep, lasting value must have either the psychic inspiration or inspiration from above the human mind levels. Poetic intelligence is there. But the highest that it can climb is the overhead poetry, where it right from the over mind it receives inspiration. And Sri Aurobindo in his letter describes all these things, so we'll read it when it comes. Then there is a very interesting chapter on psychic, mystic and spiritual poetry. And very interestingly, poet, yogi, rishi, prophet, genius. So whom do we call a yogi? So a yogi is one who unites with the divine. A yogi may or may not be a prophet, he may or may not be a seer. Similarly, a seer may not be a yogi, but he has the mantra, and that is a rishi. And then a poet. A poet is something like the highest that the mind can climb. And though he is not a seer, yet very often in the poet's writing, something of the seer is as if standing behind and trying to express itself. So they are very interesting, letters on these things. Then, of course, there is the technique, and then when he speaks about translations, how one should translate, and what is the theory of translation, what is the practice of translation, which applies to all who want to translate anything of Sri Aurobindo, especially his poetry. Because very often we see that there are literal translations and we regard them as, that's how it should be. But when we read Sri Aurobindo, we understand that one has to take into consideration many other factors than the simple literal translation. That is something anyone can do who has a knowledge of the language in terms of the meaning. Through a dictionary you can do it actually. And now AI can do it. But it's not just about the literal sense. It's something else which the poet conveys, and that should be caught. Then in part 2, some of the examples in translation are Sri Aurobindo's own translations. For instance, when he translates Shankaracharya's Bhavani Ashtakam, only a portion of it, or masterpiece, King and Yogi Bhartahari's Niti Shatakam, he has translated as the century of life, the 100, the Shatakam, and life. And when one reads it, at least I have read both. Of course, both I have read in English translation, not the original Sanskrit. But when I read Sri Aurobindo, I did feel that he has surpassed what probably King Bhartahari would have written, but he conveys the meaning so powerfully, so beautifully. So there is the art and science of translation. Even some of the writings from the Tantra which he has translated, hymn to Bhavani, goddess. So all these are very wonderful writings. Then he has, part 2 has on his own and others' poetry. So we see a lot of letters on Savitri and many other poems of his own, and they are very interesting. Some of the poems that we can read as we go by. Some ashram poets, particularly Nirodha, Amal Kiran and Harinath Chattopadhyay. Harinath Chattopadhyay, he had called him as the most authentic Indian voice in English poetry. He had great praise for him. And of course we know Amal Kiran, Arjav. So many of these poets, Sri Aurobindo's comments and Sri Aurobindo's remarks on some of their poetry is there, which is very interesting. And then section 3 is practical guidance for aspiring writers. So how to write poetry, the difference between writing poetry and writing prose. Now one must understand that he is not giving a detailed account of, if you have to write poetry, start studying this, that, not like that. But he is giving us the essence of things. And one of the simplest ways that when we hear poetry, which is truly sublime, then automatically the ear gets tuned to the poetic turn. And then it becomes much more convenient. So poetry is not just about rhyming. That's how they start with nursery rhymes in schools, that if they teach nursery rhymes, we'll develop a poetic turn. Not necessarily. In fact, most of the time, not at all. So all this is contained here. Then part 3 is literature, art, beauty and yoga, where he appreciates poetry, art, painting, visual arts, music and literature and yoga, and how they connect with each other. So, because very often again there is a idea that a yogi is just supposed to sit in meditation, but in all life is yoga. Every aspect of life can be turned into yoga, and poetry, music and art, as Sri Aurobindo says, are the perfect education for the soul. So this is basically the quick background, but we'll read some of these letters. Lot of occult truths are here, that one can go into the earth memory and retrieve what happened there, what took place, accurately according to the way one goes there. And then he says something very interesting. As I said, there are many, many beautiful side lights that one will find on the way. It's not just about poetry, but poetry is a vast literature. For instance, here in one of his letters, he says, there is an earth memory. Mother speaks about it. In fact, she says there is a place where you will find everything docketed and you can pick it out from there. So that's how she could say when a movie was shown. And the mother says it did not happen like this. It happened in a different way. Because she could enter that domain, take out, and exactly know how things happen. So Sri Aurobindo says there is an earth memory from which one gets or can get things of the past more or less accurately according to the quality of the mind that receives them. But this experience is not explicable on that basis. Now, this experience he is speaking about the experience of the mystic poets who wrote the stories of Krishna and Radha and gopis. Now, they are very high, profound mystic poetry, and the mother has rated them, and both Sri Aurobindo and the mother, as among the best occult literature. So here Sri Aurobindo says, for the gopis here are evidently not earthly beings. So here he puts a finality that, it's not that on earth you were having Vrindavan and all those stories. Most of the stories of Shri Krishna are very evidently, they are Leela which are not taking place on earth. To imagine that, there is an Aghasur who opens the mouth and everybody walks into the trap of the great python. I mean, pythons can open the mouth, but not this big that all the gopis and gopis are walking into it, thinking it's a cave. So these are obviously stories of another plane of existence. Or, Putana is conceivable, maybe to an extent Trinavrat, but most of the stories are very clearly symbolic. And the place Raihana saw was not a terrestrial locality. Somebody has had the vision and has written poetry on that. If she had got it from the earth mind at all, it could only be from the world of images created by Vaishnava tradition with perhaps a personal transcription of her own. But this also does not agree with all the details. So it's quite likely because the Vaishnava tradition has created wonderful poetry with such lovely images. Now they are part of the earth endowment. And through that door one can access and actually experience and see the Ras Leela. Now this doesn't mean that one is experiencing it on earth, but in an otherworldly plane, in an otherworldly state. So this is something very interesting. And of course there are inspirations that can come in dreams of a poetic nature, and one may forget or lose them when one wakes up. Of course, some poets have, like Coleridge's famous poem, sometimes in altered state of consciousness, they can come. And it's very difficult sometimes to carry it because the links between the plane where the vision is seen or the poetic lines have been received and the outer consciousness may not be there. Mother once speaks about her experience when she was 15. She would write poetry and usually she would keep it in the drawer. This in her sleep she would write. She would wake up and she would write. One day she forgot and a mother took it, saw it, and she said, oh my God, she's probably losing her mind because that child is writing such poetry. And they were positivists. They didn't believe in divine or anything which is to the senses intangible. So here he speaks a little bit about what is the overmind aesthesis. And here he also, obviously, we get to understand what really overmind is. The overhead consciousness, especially in the overmind, these things become more and more the law of the vision and the law of nature. Wherever the overmind spiritual man turns, he sees a universal beauty touching and uplifting all things. So this is one of the characteristics of the overmind when Sri Aurobindo says, I look at my enemy and see Krishna's face. Now, of course, this is something which goes even further, goes beyond. But in whatever direction he would turn, even things which seem to be like a battlefield where arrows are flying and where even there is things which are seemingly not so beautiful, there also he will perceive the sense of beauty and the sense of the divine presence. Okay. He feels the bliss which has created the worlds and upholds them, and all that is expresses to him the universal delight is made of it, is a manifestation of it, and molded into its image. So that also we find in Sri Aurobindo's poetry. Even when he takes us through the descent into hell, that poetry still communicates some kind of a rasa. And in Mahabharata we see it, in Ilion we see it, where even the arrows are flying and all around we see the dance of death, and yet something of this bliss can be felt in those poetic lines. When something expresses perfectly what it was meant to express, the completeness brings with it a sense of harmony, a sense of artistic perfection. It gives even to what is discordant a place in a system of cosmic concordances, and the discords become part of a vast harmony. And wherever there is harmony, there is a sense of beauty. That's why many people cannot understand certain scenes in the Mahabharata. Now, if you cut off from the totality of the scripture, then you may say that, why this scene took place. And it may seem like Vibhats, but even Vibhats has a rus within it. But when you see it in the totality of Mahabharata, or the Ramayana, for instance, I'm sure, it's there in Homer's. Homer's Iliad is definitely there. When there is a scene where Achilles goes and literally massacres, he fills the river with blood. Now, if you look at it in a certain way, it will sound very crude. When you read Parshuram had filled 5 lakes with the blood of the Kshatriyas who had totally lost their way, were arrogant Kshatriyas. And I'm forgetting the name of that place, Pancha something. No, not Panchatantra. That place, 5 lakes filled with blood. And that is the place where Kurukshetra took place later on. So it was filled with blood, and yet the beauty of that story is when this is narrated, so he kept on doing it till ultimately the divine appeared before him. Because Rama had come, and Lord Vishnu comes and says it's no more necessary because what was needed is done. Now you have the good Kshatriyas like Rama, they are already present. But then he says this place where there are 5 lakes of blood, they will be regarded as a Tirth Sthal. Now imagine, if you look at it purely from an outer point of view, now just imagine it will look like a gory scene from which people would like to shrink. But even today, even Kurukshetra is regarded as a place, holy place in Indian thought. I'm not getting into whether Kurukshetra took place in the same spot or not, but the fact is that even though a very gory war took place, of course the Gita also took place, yet it is regarded as a place which is very sacred. And the reason, if we see at the end of it, it is the victory of Dharma. So same thing we see in Parshuram's story. So he says that the beauty of the artist is, particularly those who look at things from the overmind point of view, that it brings out the beauty, the sense of divinity in everything. The overmind looks also straight at and into the soul of each thing, and not only at its form and its significance to the mind or to the life. This brings to it not only the true truth of the thing but the delight of it. So when overmind looks at events and circumstances, it doesn't look at it the way we look at it. We pass either moral judgments or we shrink from the appearance. We find it good, pleasant, unpleasant, painful. But overmind brings out the secret truth within it. So it sees also the one spirit in all, the face of the divine everywhere. And there can be no greater ananda than that. So even when it's describing something which is apparently sorrowful and suffering, it sees behind that sorrow and suffering the divine workings, as we see in Savitri several places. When Sri Aurobindo is speaking about, the spirit rises mightier with each defeat. Its godlike wings grow great with every fall. So we see that divine movement is seen, and that makes a poetry truly of the overmind level. And then, of course, he speaks of the overmind is not strictly a transcendental consciousness. That epithet would more accurately apply to the supramental and to the Satchidanand, because overmind is a cosmic consciousness. So, it's the highest point of the mind. It's from where the formature, the form makers, they start. So, that's why Sri Aurobindo in the Life Divine speaks of the overmind Maya. So, it is from where the higher and the lower Maya a little below, begin to operate. Beyond the cosmic is the transcendental. So, nevertheless, because it stands behind as if covered by a veil, through or shine through, or even only dimly glimmer through, and that brings the overmind touch or note. We cannot get this touch frequently unless we have torn the veil, made a gap in it, or rent it largely away and seen the very face of what is beyond. So, all these about the overmind is thesis. And then he gives certain very interesting lines. For instance, one of them is from Shakespeare. And in this harsh world, draw thy breath in pain. Now, compare this with, of course, the Gita, that caliber. Anityam asukham lokam. But the Gita takes another turn. It almost like from the overmind takes a flight into something very high. Bhajasvamam. But here Shakespeare says, and in this harsh world, draw thy breath in pain. Or in Wordsworth's, voyaging through strange seas of thought alone. And this one, Milton's line, lives by its choice of the word wander to co-locate with through eternity. So there are plenty of examples. Or take Shelley's stanza, we look before and after and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. Of course, we know in Hindi they had made a whole song on this. है सबसे मधुर वो गीत जो हम दर्द के सुर में गाते हैं. But this is something very different. So these are very powerful lines which come from a very high plane of. Then Sri Aurobindo has rated Shelley as one of the best, and Keats. And he says that had Keats lived, and if Shelley wrote a long poem, they would have ranked among the world's best poets. As such, they are very good. But Shelley never wrote, perhaps he tried one of the poems which remained incomplete, and so with Keats. Otherwise, they would have been ranked as one of the best poets. So here I read some of my favorite lines. The same characteristics are found in another short lyric of Shelley's, which is perhaps the purest example of the psychic inspiration in English poetry. So it's an expression of a deep psychic truth, a psychic emotion, which takes the form of a body of words and touches some deepest chord in us. And what are these lines? I can give not what men call love, but will thou accept not the worship the heart lifts above, and the heavens reject not the desire of the moth for the star, of the night for the morrow, the devotion to something afar from the sphere of her sorrow. So all these things he brings out. And then, of course, there are a lot of comments here and there. For instance, there was a famous write-up on art for the sake of art. Says, why do you want to care for anything else? And like even today, we see that artist. So artist doesn't care about form, about beauty. He's an artist because he knows how to draw and paint. But Sri Aurobindo says that why shouldn't you care for? Because in this world we are using everything to express a deeper perfection, to lift everything to the highest possibility. So why not art? So all these he speaks about, then he gives the difference between different sources of inspiration, and then he defines very interestingly mystic poetry. Mystic poetry does not mean anything exactly or apparently. It means things suggestively and reconditely, things that are not known and classified by the intellect. So, what is mystic poetry? There is something mysterious that the intellect doesn't understand or know. It is intangible. And the mystic somehow brings that feel or that atmosphere or that vision into a body of sound and words. So that is the beauty of mystic poetry. And there are plenty of other letters, but I'm just taking from here and there. And then as to symbols. So very often we see in poetry the use of symbols. In Savitri we see the use of symbol extensively. In many of the poems, for example, Rose of God. So what does the rose stand for? So there in one of the letters, Sri Aurobindo says that roses originally were not in India. They were brought from Persia. But in the Rose of God, it stands for many things. It stands for love, for bliss. So all these things he speaks about. Now the rose is very clearly a symbol. Bird of fire is a symbol. So there is a beautiful letter on some mystic symbols. If you expect matter of fact verisimilitude from N or a scientific ornithologically accurate swan. So there's a lot of humor in it also. Ornithology is the science which studies the birds, the knowledge of birds. You are knocking at the wrong door. But I don't see exactly the point of your objection. For instance, the Rig Veda, it speaks of the swan which has one leg below and one leg in the sky. And if it lifts both the legs, it will fly away. Now, obviously, such a swan doesn't exist on material earth. But the poet has used this wonderful image. Swans are supposed to go to very high regions in the Himalayan snow, and yet they can come down and drink of the waters upon earth. So, swans exist, but they are also symbol in mystic poetry. The mountains. So here he speaks about the lake in the poem is not a lake but a symbol. The swan is not a swan but a symbol. You can't expect the lake merely to ripple and do nothing else, or the swan simply to swim and eat and do nothing else. So we see, for instance, in Nala Damayanti, the swan goes and communicates. The swan here becomes the messenger of high divine truths, and it goes and communicates to Nal about the beauty of Damayanti, and then goes back and communicates something to Damayanti. So this is used, like Sri Aurobindo speaks about the ocean above and the ocean below. So a lot of Vedic poetry, even the poetry of Puranas is full of symbols. Kailash is not just Kailash on the Himalayas. So this vision we have lost, and therefore many of these stories we tend to misunderstand. For instance, when Agast Rishi crosses the Vindhyas, so it's not just literally that he stepped over Vindhya and there was a communication in a material sense. There was an occult communication. And he said that, don't rise so much that the sun is blocked. Now this story I have always found very interesting and symbolic. So it's not that any mountain can rise up and really block the view of the sun. But the sun stands for the undivided consciousness. It's a creator. And to create a divide between this sea, Vindhyas are in the middle. So to create a divide between the northern side and the southern side, which we still do, and it says, you must know. So there is a crossing over which is taking place all the time. There is a migration which is taking place all the time. And this idea of, I think the thing other than many of the other things that I learned, one of the things I learned from this story is that stop calling North India and South India. There is one India. There are northern parts of India, there is the eastern, western, central, southern parts. And each has its own beauty and uniqueness. But this divide, so Agast Rishi's story is pointing out that we should not create a divide and many other things in his story point towards this. It is as much a symbol as the bird of fire or the bird of the Vedic poet who faced the guardians of the Soma and brought the Soma to Indra, perhaps carrying a pot or several pots in his claws and beaks. For I don't know how else he could have done it. How is he to use his symbol if you do not make allowances for a miraculous swan? So again we see the story of, the birth of the Nagas and Garudas. So these are stories which are very, very clearly symbolic. And if we have a very concrete mind which only looks at the sensory truth as the truth, then poetry is a far cry. So he says these have to be taken as a symbol and becomes a metaphor. The animals of these symbols belong not to earth but to wonderland. In Sri Aurobindo Savitri we have many such animals. Griffin, then he has hippogriff, then he has plenty of others. That Ucheshava, that flying horse is also there in Savitri, finds a mention. So there are plenty of Sphinx itself is a strange creature which finds mention in poetry and literature. So many of them belong to the subtle dragon fire, bird of bliss. All these, the gold hawk can cross the fence no more. So all these are very clearly symbol. Number of flowers which are symbols of deeper truths. And the same about mystic when he speaks about the star and the moon. The spiritual vision must never be intellectual, philosophical, or abstract. It must always give the sense of something vivid, living, and concrete, a thing of vibrant beauty or a thing of power. And this is what happens when people are too much into concrete philosophical thought. Then it becomes very difficult sometimes to appreciate poetry, because they're looking for philosophical meanings. But the poetic sense is other than the way, we can derive intellectual meaning and also poetry from it. But imagine, if we were to derive, let's say, the philosophy of Savitri, it sounds very absurd. So Savitri is not philosophy, it's a vision. It's something that the seer has seen. It is a revelation. And we can make a philosophy out of the revelation, but we lose most of its beauty and delight and even the truth. So all these he reveals to us, and then of course the poet, the yogi, the mystic. So here he makes a remark which is to be seen in a certain light. People had asked Raman Maharshi about Sri Aurobindo, and they asked Sri Aurobindo about Raman Maharshi after the comment. So there is a very interesting small little letter. A rishi is one who sees or discovers an inner truth and puts it into self-effective language, the mantra. So the rishi must have a mantra. So we see that Sri Aurobindo regarded Bankim Chand as a rishi. Why he regarded him as rishi? Because somehow in some inner hearing he received the mantra of Bande Matram, and he embodied it in his book Anand Mat. So the rishi is somebody who has this innate ability. For some reason he opens to the higher realms and receives words, phrases which are mantric in nature. But if the mere poet this is the mantra, either new truth or old truth, made new by expression and intuitive realization. And then he speaks about Raman Maharshi, has experienced certain eternal truths by process of yoga. So he is a yogi without a doubt. I don't think it is by rishi-like intuition or illumination, nor has he the mantra. So he makes a distinction. He is a yogi without doubt. But rishi and mantra are terms. Rishi is a word we reserve for someone who has got that illumination, ascended to higher planes, and he is able to receive the mantra. A rishi may be a yogi, but also he may not. That explains why many of the rishis in India, when we read their lives, so you find their behavior sometimes very strange. They were not Jitendriya or Jit Krodhiya. Sri Aurobindo writes about that. That Vishwamitra, Parashar, you can't call them as Jitendriya. Similarly, Durvasha, even Vishwamitra, you can't call them as Jit Krodhiya. So they had their defects and this thing. They may not be the perfected image of yogis, but they were rishis. Because they could see a higher truth, they had ascended to a higher plane. So a yogi may be a rishi, but also he may not. Just as a philosopher may or may not be a poet, and a poet may or may not be a philosopher. Poetic intuition and illumination is not the same thing as rishi intuition and illumination. Poetic intuition and illumination comes at a plane just a little below the seer. So all these beautiful things. And then he speaks about a genius. Who is a genius? I never heard of anyone getting genius by effort. So of course it's contradictory. One can increase one's talent by training and labor. But genius is a gift of nature. This is what is called a genius in the Western context. In Indian context would be something like a vibhuti. An extraordinary afflatus of the divine consciousness in one particular dimension. Exaggeration of in one dimension. By sadhana it is different. One can do it, but that is not the fruit of effort, but either of an inflow or by an opening or liberation of some important impersonal power or manifestation of unmanifested power. So in yoga, the door may open to a higher consciousness which may suddenly pick up some possibility in the sadhak and turn him into a genius. And I suppose that would explain some of the people open to Sri Aurobindo and the mother who turned into a genius in poetry and many other areas. And then of course he speaks about experiences and imagination and all these questions that we often ask and get mixed up. Then he speaks about rhythm. How can rhythm be explained? It is a matter of the ear, not of the intellect. Of course, there are the technical elements, but you say you do not understand yet about them. But it is not a matter of technique only. The same outer technique can produce successful or unsuccessful rhythms. One has to learn to distinguish by the ear, and the difficulty for you is to get the right sense of the cadences of the English language. That is not easy, for it has many outer and inner elements. And yes, it can come by grace. So this idea that, catching that rhythm and defining that rhythm and talking about techniques, it has its place and its importance. But something much more important is the awakening of the inner ear, as the Ken Upanishad puts it, the ear behind the ear. And of course it speaks about very bit humorously about iambics and anapaests, free verse. Very often we hear these terms about Savitri. Iambics and anapaests can be combined in English verse at any time, provided one does not set out to write a purely iambic or a purely anapaestic meter. Mixed anapaest and iamb make a most beautifully flexible lyric rhythm. It has no more connection with the free words than the constellation of the great bear has to do with the cat's tail. Free words, now he describes free words. Free words indicates words free from the shackles of rhyme and meter, but rhythmic or trying to be rhythmic in one way or another. If you put rhymes, it will be considered a shackle and the free will kick at the chain. So, by its nature it is free verse. It has a rhythm and one has to get at the rhythm. And then discusses the problem of free verse, etc. And then he even speaks about, rhymes in English poetry like Humpty Dumpty and all this, and why. He said that may be very lovely, but that's not the way to really discover poetry. Then they are very interesting letters on Savitri, and one of them is, someone has asked him, with your silent consciousness, it should be possible to draw from the highest planes with the slightest pull. So why you had to write Savitri 12 times nearly? Even some other poems, Rose of God, there are other Nirvana. So he has corrected them. But he says very clearly, these corrections also came by the inspiration from above. So corrections were not made on the basis of an intellectual reading. The corrections came from above and the recorrections also came from above. And here Sri Aurobindo gives an answer. The highest planes are not so accommodating as all that. If they were so, why should it be difficult to bring down and organize the supermind in the physical consciousness? So there are states of consciousness that you can experience. But if you have to give them a form of words which embody that state of consciousness, it requires effort. It doesn't happen easily. Because the higher we rise, the freer the consciousness becomes, the vaster it becomes, more supple it becomes. Very difficult to then chain it in any way, including a set of words. What happy-go-lucky, fancy, web-spinning, ignoramuses you all are. You speak of silence, consciousness, overmental, supramental, etc. as if they were so many electric buttons. You have only to press and there you are. So of course, apart from the humor, there is so much profound truth in it. It may be one day, but meanwhile, I have to discover everything about the working of all possible modes of electricity. Of course, electricity here is referring to the supramental and of course expressing it, manifesting upon earth. All the laws, possibilities, perils, etc. Construct modes of connection and communication. Make the whole far-wiring system. Try to find out how it can be made foolproof, and all that in the course of a single lifetime. And I have to do it while my blessed disciples are firing off their gay or gloomy a priori reasonings at me from a position of entire irresponsibility and expecting me to divulge everything to them, not in hints, but at length. Lord God in omnibus. And that is why we see that initially it was just a small nucleus of people in the ashram. Sri Aurobindo did not allow this expansion. It is only after the supramental manifestation. Until then, the perils, what may happen, because when such a truth descends, and that's what we see in Savitri, truth descending too soon might break the imperfect earth. So he had to do this, make it foolproof, everything, and then yes, it could be carried to the world. And then we come toward the end. He says that somebody has translated one of his poems. And he speaks about it that the idea is that work and knowledge and power can only obey the divine and give him service. Love alone can compel him because, of course, this is about the poem God, where Sri Aurobindo writes that master of all who work and rule and know, servant of love. So somebody has translated it in Bengali. And Sri Aurobindo says that, well, the idea in the poem is that work and knowledge and power can only obey the divine and give him service. Love alone can compel him, because of course love is self-giving and the divine gives himself in return. As for the second verse, it does not give the idea at all, that is, he who disdaineth not the worm to be, nor even the clod. So Sri Aurobindo says, to have no contempt for the clod or the worm does not indicate that the non-despiser is the divine. Such an idea would be absolutely meaningless and in the last degree feeble. This small little example is to convey to us how when we literally translate, we may lose the inner sense. Because actually if you see the poem, it's all about God, what he can do with all that greatness and glory, the humility that he can even identify with it and lift it up. That is the idea. Not regarding it as equal, as it is said in the Gita. That's a yogi who can do it. Any yogi could have that equality, or somebody much less than a yogi. The idea is that being omnipotent, omniscient, infinite, supreme, the divine does not scorn to descend even into the lowest forms, the obscurest figures of nature, and animate them with the divine presence. That shows his divinity. The whole sense has fizzled out in the translation. So when we literally translate, obviously, if you literally translate, it would be that thou who disdainest not. Now, this thou is about the divine. This thou is not anyone who does not disdain the warm and the clod. And now this is possible for any yogi. So this is where probably the error took place. And he says the whole senses fizzled out. And then, but he says something, his perfect gentlemanliness. You need not say all that to the poetess that I am writing to you. But perhaps you might very delicately hint to her that if she could bring in this point, it would be better. Only Sri Aurobindo knows how to even make criticism beautiful. Then perhaps she would herself change the words. And then, of course, there are a number of some letters on the bird of fire. The bird of fire is the living vehicle of the gold fire of the divine light, and the whole fire of the divine, and the white fire of the divine tapas, and the crimson fire of divine love, for everything else of the divine consciousness. So there are, beautiful images, and Sri Aurobindo's reply on Rose of God, that roses were found in Persia. 7 ecstasies are 7 layers at which the bliss expresses itself. And then comes something very interesting. Amalda asked him that, why don't you send us some poetry of the overmind heights? And Sri Aurobindo says that it is, he needs the time and all that. But suddenly, he sends to the writer. This is a very interesting letter which Amal Kiran speaks of in his own reminiscences. That how he had asked, and Sri Aurobindo suddenly graciously sent to him the first few lines of Savitri. And that is how Savitri started coming out into the world. Because he had asked for it. And so he says that, you can't have just overmind manufactured to order. All I can do is to give you from time to time some lines from Savitri, on condition you keep them to yourself for the present. And later on he revised them and made it still further. And Amal Kiran writes that, Nolnida was the divine postman. He would carry Sri Aurobindo's letters to people. And Sri Aurobindo had said not to share what he is writing to Amal Kiran. And he says when Amal Kiran would receive, Nolnida would keep looking at him a bit, maybe he was able to read something that, there inside or there going on in Amal Kiran's mind. And he was looking bit puzzled, bit, a strange expression on his face. And these are the lines which he has given. It was the hour before the gods awake. Across the path of the divine event, the huge, now this is, see, he has corrected it later on. But here he's sending him one of the early drafts, the huge unslumbering spirit of night. But later on he writes the huge foreboding mind of night. The huge unslumbering spirit of night alone in the unlit temple of immensity. Later on it becomes inner unlit temple of eternity. So that's how he gives it, and at the end he writes there, promise fulfilled for a wonder. So this is how, and how he took criticism. There's something to be learned. Just imagine, of course there were people, the higher you rise, the more you are likely to be criticized. It's almost like an axiomatic rule because you'll be the most misunderstood. But here it's about poetry. Now, normally if you have made a creation and somebody criticizes you, how you would take it. But look at how Sri Aurobindo takes it. So, when some of these lines were criticized because people didn't understand, and even Amal Kiran would write. Of course, Amal Kiran later on said, I deliberately used to ask him these questions so that, in the eyes of the world, the poetry can come out as perfect. But whatever be the reason, Generally, in yoga, we don't expect to ask the guru and point out that there could be a mistake here and a mistake there. And when he spoke to Sri Aurobindo, there is a long letter where he accepts some of them that, okay, you have pointed out, a little bit change. But later on, he rationally explains one after another why it should be here and why this is not to be substituted, what this image means, and any other image that you are suggesting would not go. And it is on this basis that the mother had made a remark once. He said that, and people had the audacity to ask him questions and point out to him his mistakes. And then she says, and Sri Aurobindo, like a perfect gentleman, would spend time to keep on replying and explaining. He didn't have to explain. He could have just said, see, I don't have time for all this. I know what I have written. And just take it or leave it. But yet he would sometimes just accept a little bit and change. That's his humility. So three things that the mother spoke about Sri Aurobindo. One is his humility. Second is compassion. Third is his gentlemanliness. Of course, many other things apart. But in this letter, the last letter which we'll read today, we'll do a second part because it's a very beautiful volume. So he says, I am not at all times impervious to criticism. I have accepted some of yours and changed my lines accordingly. It is. I mean, actually, if you read the lines he has changed, it looks like it is just a concession given to a disciple. But the Lord can do it. I have also, though not often, accepted some adverse criticism from outside and remolded a line or a passage from here and there. But your criticisms are based upon an understanding appreciation of the poem, its aim, meaning, method, the turn and quality of its language and verse technique. In your friend's judgment, I find an entire absence of any such understanding, and accordingly I find his criticisms to be irrelevant and invalid. What one does not understand or perceive its meaning and spirit, one cannot fruitfully criticize. So even to criticize, one must understand the meaning, purpose, the way, the method, the aim, everything. Then only one has a right. And look at Sri Aurobindo with all his achievements, his knowledge, his caliber, capacity, how he is accepting it, a place or here, there, modifying it. And when he is not accepting, he is giving his own reasons in some of the most perfectly gentlemanly language. This is something which one finds repeatedly in Sri Aurobindo. Namaste.